Last time, we left John Robinson standing at the edge of something new. For 20 years, he'd stolen money, forged letters, and talked his way out of every consequence that came his way. Then, a 19-year-old woman named Paula Godfrey vanished after taking a job with one of his companies. A single typewritten letter arrived, claiming she was fine. She was never seen again. At the time, almost nobody connected it to him. It looked like just one more strange loose end in a life already full of them. One more oddity in the file of a man everyone already knew as a fraud, but nothing worse than that. It wasn't a loose end. It was the beginning of a body count that would eventually reach at least 7 women. Women he found, isolated, and killed, using the exact same skills he'd spent 2 decades perfecting on doctors, corporations, and an entire city government. The charm that once forged a Man of the Year award would now be used to forge something far more permanent. This is the story of how he did it. Kansas City, Missouri, January 1985. Inside a shelter for women fleeing domestic violence, a 19-year-old named Lisa Stasi was trying to rebuild a life for herself and her 4-month-old daughter, Tiffany. John Robinson found her there.
He introduced himself as the head of a charitable organization, the same practiced role he'd been perfecting for a decade, the wholesome community man who helped young mothers get back on their feet. He offered Lisa something she desperately needed, a job in Chicago and childcare support for her baby while she got settled. All she had to do was sign a few documents to get the process started. She signed them. Blank documents. Documents she had no way of knowing would later be used to forge her own consent. Think about how deliberately that moment was engineered. A blank signature isn't just paperwork. It's a blank check for someone else's story. Robinson didn't need to threaten her, didn't need to force anything. He simply needed her to trust him for about 10 minutes, in a moment when she was more vulnerable and more hopeful than she'd been in months. Lisa Stasi was murdered within days of meeting him, and her body has never been found. Using the blank paperwork Lisa had unknowingly signed, Robinson forged her signature onto adoption papers. He delivered baby Tiffany to his own brother, Don, and Don's wife, a couple who had been unable to conceive and were desperate for a child. Robinson charged them a few $1,000s for the adoption, and the baby was renamed. She grew up as their daughter, completely unaware that her real mother had ever existed, let alone what had happened to her.
For 15 years, that little girl called a convicted serial killer Uncle John at family gatherings. Think about the sheer logistics of what you just heard. This wasn't a moment of rage, it was a plan with multiple moving parts. Forged signatures, a fabricated adoption, a paper trail built specifically to survive scrutiny. The same meticulous, patient construction he'd once used to build fake companies and fraudulent charities was now being used to erase a human being and quietly absorb what she left behind. 2 years later, in 1987, a 27-year-old woman named Catherine Clampett moved to Kansas City, trying to turn her life around after a long struggle with addiction. Robinson offered her a job at one of his shell companies, the same kind of hollow, official-sounding business that had defrauded a Fortune 500 corporation and a room full of city officials. She was told she was being sent on a work trip. Catherine Clampett disappeared after that trip and was never heard from again. Her body has never been recovered. Her brother filed a missing persons report. It went nowhere. There was no obvious connection to Robinson, just another vanished woman in a city where, on paper, he was still a respected businessman. Here's what should unsettle you about this pattern. Robinson wasn't hunting strangers in dark alleys.
He was recruiting victims the exact same way he recruited investors and employees, with a job offer, a promise of stability, a paper trail that looked completely legitimate, right up until the person behind it vanished. Look at what these 2 women had in common. Lisa Stasi was a young mother with almost nowhere else to turn. Catherine Clampett was rebuilding her life after addiction, trying to prove to herself and everyone around her that things were finally going to be different. Robinson didn't choose his victims at random. He specifically sought out women in transition, women whose lives were already in flux, whose absence wouldn't immediately raise alarms, and who were, by circumstance rather than character, less likely to have a dense safety net of people checking in on them. For a few years, the pattern seems to pause, at least the killings do. The fraud never stopped. Robinson kept building and collapsing businesses, kept getting arrested, kept talking his way into lighter sentences.
In the early 1990s, one of those sentences finally landed him behind bars at the Western Missouri Correctional Center, and it was there, of all places, that he met his next victim. Her name was Beverly Bonner. She was 49 years old, the prison librarian, and married to the facility's doctor. Robinson, ever the charming inmate, struck up a friendship with her. By the time he was released, that friendship had turned into something else entirely. Beverly left her husband.
Robinson gave her a job managing the finances of one of his ventures, married in name only to her new role as his devoted assistant. Sometime in 1994, Robinson murdered Beverly Bonner, but he didn't let her disappear quietly. For years afterward, he continued writing letters in her name, using her voice to keep her ex-husband and family from asking questions, while he redirected her alimony payments to a post office box he controlled. As far as anyone knew, Beverly Bonner had simply moved to Australia and cut off contact with the people who loved her. Her remains sat inside a sealed steel barrel for 6 years before anyone found her. Also in 1994, the same year he killed Beverly Bonner, Robinson made contact online with a woman named Sheila Faith. Sheila had a teenage daughter, Debbie, who used a wheelchair and required expensive medical care. Robinson, presenting himself once again as a man of means and generosity, promised Sheila a job and financial help for her daughter's treatment. He convinced her to pack up her life and move to Kansas City. Robinson murdered both Sheila Faith and her daughter Debbie shortly after they arrived.
And then he did something almost too calculated to process. He kept cashing Sheila's Social Security and pension checks for years afterward, forging her signature, corresponding as her, maintaining the illusion that a disabled teenager and her mother were simply living quietly out of touch with the world, instead of decomposing inside chemical drums in a rented storage locker across the state line. Pause on that for a second. This is a man who, in the same 12-month period, murdered 3 people, a former prison librarian and a mother with her disabled daughter, while simultaneously running his usual carousel of fraudulent businesses, without ever losing his composure at a single dinner party, church function, or business meeting in between. He went home to his wife of decades. He saw his own children, and by every account, none of them ever noticed a single crack in the performance. Investigators would later determine that all of his victims died the same way, 1 or 2 blows to the head, quiet, fast, designed to leave as little evidence and as little noise as possible. By the mid-1990s, something had shifted in how Robinson operated, and it's the piece of this story we teased at the very beginning. While most of the country was still getting used to the idea of dial-up modems and chat rooms, Robinson had already identified the internet as the single greatest tool he'd ever had access to.
Here was a space where he could present himself however he wanted, to an almost unlimited pool of strangers, with none of the friction of real-world introductions. No neighbors to vouch for him, no employer to check references, no in-person meeting until he'd already decided exactly how the story would unfold. He gravitated toward online BDSM and lifestyle communities, where he adopted the persona of a wealthy, dominant master, offering vulnerable, often isolated women what he framed as protection, financial security, and structure in exchange for total submission. It's worth pausing here to notice what hadn't changed at all. The internet didn't create a new version of John Robinson. It simply gave the same man, the forger, the fake CEO, the self-appointed man of the year, a far larger pond to fish in, and a far easier way to control exactly what his victims knew about him before it was too late to matter. In 1997, a 21-year-old fine arts student named Izabela Luika, a Polish immigrant studying at Purdue University, connected with Robinson through one of these communities. She dropped out of school and moved in with him. Robinson had her sign what he called a slave contract, a real document drawn from templates that circulate in that community, that formally handed him control over her belongings, her finances, and, on paper at least, her entire life for the next 115 years.
To the outside world, Isabella was simply his intern at a publishing company that didn't actually exist. In August 1999, John Robinson murdered Izabela Luika. When friends and acquaintances started asking questions about where she'd gone, Robinson had an answer ready, the same way he always did. He told them she'd been caught using drugs and deported back to Poland. It was a lie efficient enough that almost nobody thought to push further. Investigators would later find her blood spattered throughout the apartment where she'd lived with him. His final victim was a 28-year-old nurse named Suzette Troughton.
Like Isabella, Suzette had met Robinson through an online BDSM community, drawn in by the same promise of a wealthy protector who would take care of her in exchange for submission. She told her family she was moving to Kansas to take a job caring for Robinson's elderly parents. Before she disappeared, Robinson sent her a message that investigators would later recover, a message that, in hindsight, reads like the thesis statement of his entire adult life. He was a wealthy businessman, he told her, and he was going to take care of her. She could be his slave. Robinson murdered Suzette Troughton in early 2000, but this time something was different. Suzette's mother wasn't the kind of person who accepted silence easily. When her daughter stopped calling, she pushed. She contacted the police. She refused to let the case go quiet the way so many of Robinson's other victims had. Around the same time, 2 other women came forward with a different kind of complaint, allegations of sexual battery against Robinson, unrelated on the surface, but enough to finally put his name in front of investigators with real urgency behind it. On June 2, 2000, a task force raided Robinson's mobile home on a rural property near Lesig, Kansas. Inside, they found 2 sealed chemical drums. Each one contained a body. They belonged to Isabella Luica and Suzette Troughton.
Following the trail across the state line into Missouri, investigators searched a storage facility where Robinson rented space under a false name. There, they found 3 more barrels: Beverly Bonner, Sheila Faith, and her daughter Debbie, all sealed away in the same manner, all killed the same way. 5 bodies, recovered in a single week from 2 different states, from a man who, right up until that moment, had spent his entire adult life being described by the people around him as charming, respectable, and completely unremarkable. Neighbors near the Lesigan property later told reporters they'd occasionally noticed a strange smell or wondered about the comings and goings at odd hours. Nobody had thought it worth mentioning to anyone. That's how thoroughly Robinson had built his cover, not through secrecy alone, but through decades of being the kind of person nobody thinks to suspect. 2 more victims, Lisa Stassi and Paula Godfrey, were never found at all. Their fates were pieced together entirely through paperwork, forged signatures, and the testimony of a baby girl who grew up not knowing her own name. Here's the thing that should genuinely disturb you about all of this. Every single one of these women was killed the exact same way Robinson had been defrauding people for 30 years. He found someone with a specific need, a job, a home, financial security, a sense of being wanted, and he offered to fill it.
He built trust with paperwork, with charm, with the same unshakable confidence that had once fooled a war hero, a Fortune 500 company, and an entire city hall. The only difference was what he took at the end. Psychologists who later studied his case pointed to something chilling in its simplicity. Robinson never needed violence as a first move. Violence was always the very last step, after the manipulation had already done all the real work. After trust was built, isolation was complete, and the victim had no one left checking in on them. By the time the ending came, almost nobody in her life was in a position to ask questions for weeks, sometimes years. That's not the profile of someone driven by uncontrollable rage. That's the profile of someone who saw people as problems to be managed. The same cold, patient calculation of a man closing out a fraudulent business and quietly opening the next one under a different name. And maybe that's the most unsettling takeaway from everything you've just heard. We tend to imagine killers as people who look wrong somehow, as if danger should announce itself. Robinson spent his entire life proving the opposite. He coached baseball. He taught Sunday school. He was, on paper and in person, one of the most trusted men in his community, right up until investigators pried open 5 sealed steel drums and found out exactly what trust had cost.
In October 2003, John Robinson pleaded guilty to 5 of the murders in Missouri and had already been sentenced in Kansas for 3 more. He remains in prison to this day, having never once, in decades of interviews and letters, expressed anything resembling genuine remorse. Next time, we go inside the trial itself, the 6-week case that became the longest criminal prosecution in Kansas history, and the moment the mask finally, permanently came off.